You're fired. And you're out. Thomas Whitaker's voice cut through the conference room like a blade, cold and final. I stood frozen at the head of the table, my coffee cup halfway to my lips, as 20 staff members suddenly found their laptops fascinating. The silence felt suffocating, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning and my own thundering heartbeat. Security waited outside the glass doors, their presence a deliberate humiliation. "Excuse me," I managed to whisper, setting down my cup with trembling hands. Thomas leaned back in his leather chair, his silver hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the windows. He looked almost bored, as if firing his daughter-in-law was just another Tuesday afternoon task to check off his list. "You heard me, Emily. We're restructuring and your services are no longer required. Please collect your personal items and leave the premises immediately." I looked desperately at Daniel, my husband of 5 years, standing beside his father like a loyal soldier. He wouldn't meet my eyes. His jaw was clenched, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, staring at the floor as if the carpet pattern held all the answers to the universe. "Daniel." My voice cracked on his name. He said nothing. The walk to my office felt like a funeral march. Security flanked me on both sides as if I might steal office supplies or set fire to the building. Staff members I'd worked alongside for years ducked into doorways, pretending they hadn't seen me. The shame burned hotter than any anger I might have felt. I packed my desk in silence. Family photos, my favorite coffee mug, the plant I'd kept alive for 3 years. My hands shook as I emptied drawers, trying to maintain some dignity while 2 stone-faced security guards watched my every move. As I carried my cardboard box toward the elevator, Thomas appeared in the hallway, blocking my path with that smug expression I'd grown to hate over the years. "You were never an owner, Emily. Just a helper." The words hit like a physical blow. 5 years of 60-hour weeks, of saved contracts and expansion plans, of sacrificing time with friends and family to build this company, reduced to just a helper. "I built half of what this company is," I said quietly. Thomas smiled, cold and sharp. "You signed everything away." The apartment felt too quiet when I arrived home. I set the cardboard box on the kitchen counter and stared at it, this pathetic collection of personal items that represented 5 years of my life. The framed photo of Daniel and me at our wedding mocked me from the top of the pile, both of us smiling like we'd conquered the world together. What a lie that had been. I heard Daniel's key in the lock around 7 that evening. He walked in like nothing had happened, loosening his tie and heading straight for the refrigerator without even looking at me. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Not now, Emily. I'm exhausted. Your father fired me today. In front of the entire staff. With security escorts. I think now is exactly the time to talk." Daniel finally turned to face me, his expression cold and distant. This wasn't the man I'd married. Or maybe it was and I'd just been too blind to see it. "It's what's best for the family," he said simply, as if that explained everything. "Best for the family?" I repeated, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I am your family, Daniel. Or have you forgotten that?" He poured himself a glass of water, taking his time making me wait. The casual cruelty of it made my chest tight with rage I'd been suppressing all day. "The company is being restructured. We're preparing for a major transition and Dad felt you were too emotional to handle the changes." Emotional. The word tasted bitter. "I increased our client base by 40% last year. I negotiated the Henderson contract that everyone said was impossible. I worked through weekends while you played golf with your father." "That's exactly what I'm talking about," Daniel said, his voice sharp. "You're getting emotional right now. We need clear heads for what's coming." I studied his face, looking for any trace of the man I'd loved. "What's coming, Daniel? What are you not telling me?" He set down his glass with deliberate care. "The company is about to be sold. A significant offer came in last week and we need to move quickly. You were a liability in the negotiations." The room tilted slightly. "You're selling. You might want to delay that sale," I said calmly, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. 2 years earlier, I'd been sitting in a different conference room, watching Thomas squirm as the bank representative laid out their concerns about our refinancing application. The company needed capital desperately after a rough quarter, and the bank wanted assurances before extending our credit line. "There are significant accounting discrepancies we need addressed," the bank officer had said, sliding a folder across the table. Before we can approve this refinancing, we need complete transparency on your financial structure. Thomas had waved dismissively. That's all handled internally. Nothing to worry about. With respect, Mr. Whitaker, our auditors disagree. These numbers don't align with your reported earnings. I'd been taking notes quietly in the corner, supposedly they're just to observe. But something about Thomas's defensiveness made my instincts flare. I'd spent the previous month reviewing our books, trying to understand why our profits looked strong on paper but our cash flow told a different story. I'd like to attend the legal meeting, I'd said suddenly, to ensure all documentation is properly filed. Thomas's eyes had snapped to mine, irritation flashing across his face. That's not necessary, Emily. Daniel and I can handle it. Actually, the bank representative had interjected, we'd prefer multiple stakeholders present for documentation purposes. It protects everyone's interests. I'd shown up to that legal meeting despite Thomas's obvious displeasure. The attorney had spread documents across the conference table, standard refinancing agreements, personal guarantees, collateral schedules. Everything seemed routine until the bank's lawyer introduced a secondary document. This is a performance-based equity agreement, he'd explained. It's required for this level of financing. Basically, it ensures that all managing partners maintain fiduciary responsibility to the company and its stakeholders. What does that mean in plain English? I'd asked. The lawyer had smiled. It means if any partner breaches their fiduciary duty, acts against the company's best interests or violates governance standards, the equity structure can be reconfigured to protect the business. Thomas had signed it impatiently, barely reading the terms. I remembered watching his pen move across the signature line, wondering if he understood what he was agreeing to. 2 weeks later, my own attorney had called. Emily, you need to understand something about that contract Thomas signed. If they breach fiduciary duty, this flips in your favor. Back in the present, I sat alone in the apartment, Daniel having left for his father's house to discuss strategy. The silence gave me time to think, to piece together the puzzle I'd been too trusting to see forming around me. My phone buzzed. It was Marcus, one of our senior project managers and one of the few people who'd made eye contact with me during my humiliating exit. Emily, I shouldn't be calling, but you need to know, they've been planning this for months. My stomach dropped. Planning what? Your removal. I saw draft documents 3 months ago, restructuring the operational authority. Your name was crossed out on every leadership chart. I thought maybe they were just considering options, but after today... Why didn't you tell me? Marcus's sigh was heavy through the phone. I thought about it every day. But I have a family, a mortgage. If Thomas knew I'd leaked internal documents, I'd be finished in this industry. I'm sorry, Emily. I should have warned you. After we hung up, I sat staring at my laptop screen, a plan forming. Send me certified copies of all corporate filings from the past year. I emailed our corporate attorney. Every document related to company structure and ownership. The envelope arrived 2 days later. I spread the documents across my dining table, my hands steady despite the rage building in my chest. Board resolutions, amended bylaws, restructured equity agreements, all filed quietly over the past 6 months, each one slowly diminishing my authority while I'd been too focused on actual work to notice the political maneuvering happening around me. Then I saw it. A formal letter from Thomas to the corporate secretary, dated 2 weeks ago, claiming I had violated company policy by unauthorized communications with clients and insubordinate behavior towards senior management. Every word was a lie. I'd never been written up, never been counseled, never even received a verbal warning about my performance. This was fabricated evidence to justify my termination, created after the fact to cover their tracks. My lawyer called that afternoon. Emily, I need you to look at the date of your termination very carefully. October 15th. Why? Because of the timing. That performance-based equity agreement Thomas signed? It has a specific clause about wrongful termination. If a managing partner is fired without cause or due process, especially after concerns were raised about financial irregularities, the contract has a trigger mechanism. My heart started pounding. What kind of trigger? The kind that transfers 51% voting control to the terminated partner, my lawyer said quietly. Emily, if we can prove your termination was wrongful, and based on these fabricated documents, you technically control the company now. I sat down hard, my legs suddenly unable to support me. That's impossible. It's not only possible, it's explicitly written into the contract. The bank required this protection because they were concerned about Thomas's judgment. If he acts against the company's interests by removing competent leadership for personal reasons, the equity structure automatically rebalances. But how do I actually enforce this? Formal presentation at the upcoming board meeting. It requires 3 independent board members to witness the claim and vote on its validity. If they agree the termination was wrongful, the transfer is immediate and binding. I thought about the board, Thomas's golf buddies, his former college roommate, the business associates who owed him favors. The board will never vote against Thomas. Maybe. But there's one independent member, the bank's representative, who has a fiduciary duty to protect the company's interests. And based on what I'm seeing, they might be very interested in preventing a hasty sale that could expose them to liability. While I was piecing together my legal strategy, Thomas was busy rewriting history. Staff members started forwarding me screenshots of the company-wide email he'd sent. Emily Morrison has chosen to pursue other opportunities and will no longer be with Whitaker Development. We wish her well in her future endeavors. Chosen. As if I'd walked away from 5 years of my life voluntarily. But social media had different ideas. Our company Instagram, which I'd built from 0 to 50,000 followers, exploded with confused and angry comments. Customers loved our brand presence. The behind-the-scenes content, the project updates, the personal touch I'd brought to what could have been a boring construction company. "Where's Emily?" one comment asked. "She was the only reason I followed this account." "The company won't be the same without her leadership," another wrote. Thomas tried damage control, posting bland corporate statements. But the backlash grew stronger. Several of our biggest clients called asking what had happened, expressing concern about project continuity. Then a local business reporter reached out. "Ms. Morrison, I'd love to hear your side of the story about your departure from Whitaker Development. There's a lot of speculation and I think our readers deserve the truth." I stared at the message, my finger hovering over the reply button. I didn't respond to the journalist. Not yet. But I saved the message, knowing that public opinion was already shifting in my direction without me saying a word. Sometimes silence speaks louder than any statement. My lawyer called with urgent news 3 days later. "Emily, the company is 72 hours from signing a sale agreement. I just got word through a contact at the buyer's firm." 3 days? That's incredibly fast for a business sale. Suspiciously fast. And here's the problem. If they complete the sale before your claim is officially filed and recognized by the board, ownership becomes murky. They could argue the contract terms are void because the company changed hands. Can they do that? They can try. It would be tied up in court for years. But if we file an emergency injunction right now, we can freeze the sale until your ownership claim is resolved. I thought about Daniel's smug face when he told me I was a liability. I thought about Thomas calling me just a helper. I thought about 5 years of my life being erased as if I'd never mattered at all. "File it," I said. "File everything." The injunction hit Thomas's desk at 4 p.m. that afternoon. My lawyer called me an hour later, barely containing his laughter. You should have seen his face. Daniel came home that night with fury in his eyes. He slammed the door hard enough to rattle the picture frames on the wall, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt genuine fear in my own home. An injunction? Are you insane? I stood my ground, keeping the kitchen island between us. I'm protecting my interests in a company I helped build. Your interests? He laughed, cold and bitter. You have no interests. You were an employee, Emily. A well-paid employee, sure, but that's all you ever were. The contracts say differently. What contracts? I smiled, thinking of the documents locked in my lawyer's safe. The ones your father signed without reading them carefully. The ones that make wrongful termination very expensive for him. Daniel's face went red. This is why we didn't want you involved in the sale. You're vindictive and petty. You can't handle the fact that Dad built this company long before you showed up. Actually, I can't handle the fact that your father is destroying it through arrogance and poor judgment. That sale you're pushing through? It's undervalued by at least 30%. I've seen the market comparables. He stepped toward me and I backed away instinctively. You have 48 hours to drop the injunction and sign divorce papers. In exchange, I'll make sure you get a fair settlement. Keep fighting and you'll get nothing. You always believed I married up, didn't you? I said quietly, Daniel's ultimatum still hanging in the air between us. His silence was answer enough. All those times you introduced me as, just, a marketing coordinator, never mentioning I'd restructured our entire client communication system. All those family dinners where your father talked business and you never asked my opinion, even though I was sitting right there with a master's degree in business management. You never saw me as an equal. Because you weren't, Daniel said simply, and the honesty of it was somehow worse than the cruelty. You came from nothing, Emily. My father gave you an opportunity, and you should have been grateful instead of grasping for more. I thought about the nights I'd stayed up late fixing his mistakes, the clients I'd saved after his fumbled presentations, the strategies I'd developed that he'd presented as his own ideas. I'd been so eager to prove myself worthy of this family that I'd let them take credit for my work without complaint. Get out, I said quietly. This is my apartment. Actually, check the lease. I'm the primary tenant because your credit score was too low when we signed. Get out, Daniel. Pack a bag and go to your father's house. You can have your lawyer contact mine about the divorce. The next morning I walked into the board meeting unannounced. I'd learned from Marcus that Thomas had scheduled an emergency session to approve the sale, thinking I'd be too intimidated by the injunction to show my face. The room fell silent when I entered. Thomas's smirk was infuriating, his confidence absolute. He probably thought I was there to beg or negotiate or make a scene that would prove his claims about my emotional instability. Instead, I walked calmly to the conference table and placed a folder in front of each board member. My lawyer entered behind me, his presence shifting the atmosphere from hostile to suddenly very serious. Gentlemen, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. I'm here to present evidence of wrongful termination and breach of fiduciary duty. Thomas actually laughed. This is absurd. Emily, you're embarrassing yourself. Mr. Whitaker, my attorney interrupted, I suggest you review the documents before you speak further. Particularly the performance-based equity agreement you signed 2 years ago during the bank refinancing. I watched Thomas's face as he opened the folder and recognition slowly dawned. The smirk faded. His face went pale. He looked at his own lawyer who was reading quickly, his expression growing more concerned with each page. This is a standard equity agreement, Thomas blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. It doesn't mean anything. Actually, the bank's representative spoke up from the end of the table. It means quite a lot. I have a letter here from our legal department confirming that attempting to remove Mrs. Morrison without cause, particularly while concealing financial irregularities and rushing through a sale, constitutes a direct violation of our financing agreement's ethical governance requirements. Daniel, sitting beside his father, looked genuinely panicked for the first time. His confident mask cracked, revealing the scared boy underneath who'd always relied on his father to fix his problems. The bank is freezing the pending sale, the representative continued, until this matter is resolved. If the board determines that Mrs. Morrison was wrongfully terminated, the equity transfer clause activates immediately. If the board determines the termination was justified, we'll require a full forensic audit before approving any sale. Thomas's lawyer leaned over to whisper frantically in his ear. I watched Thomas's expression shift from anger to disbelief to something that looked like genuine fear. This is blackmail, Thomas said weakly. This is contract enforcement, my lawyer replied. You signed an agreement. Mrs. Morrison is simply asking that you honor it. The independent board member cleared his throat. I move that we vote on the validity of Mrs. Morrison's termination. The vote took less than 5 minutes. 3 board members, including the bank representative and the independent member, sided with me. Thomas's loyalists tried to argue, but the facts were undeniable. Fabricated violation letters, no documentation of poor performance, rushed termination without due process. When the final vote was counted, the room fell silent. The motion passes, the independent board member announced. Per the terms of the equity agreement, 51% voting control of Whitaker Development is hereby transferred to Emily Morrison, effective immediately. I sat very still, trying to process what had just happened. 5 days ago I'd been escorted from this building by security guards. Now I owned controlling interest in the company. Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is not over. Actually, my lawyer said calmly, it is. Mrs. Morrison now has the authority to approve or reject any sale, hire or fire any executive, and restructure the company as she sees fit. I suggest you cooperate with the transition rather than make this more difficult than it needs to be. I finally spoke, my voice quiet but firm. As my first act as majority shareholder, I'm halting the sale pending a comprehensive valuation. The company will not be sold in haste to cover up poor management decisions. The news spread through the office like wildfire. I could see it happening in real time. The shocked faces, the whispered conversations, the way staff members started looking at Thomas differently. The man who'd ruled this company like a tyrant for 30 years had just lost everything to the daughter-in-law he'd publicly humiliated. By afternoon I was receiving messages from employees I barely knew. Congratulations. About time. Thank you for fighting back. The support was overwhelming and humbling. Marcus stopped by my temporary office. I don't know if you remember this, but during the pandemic when everything shut down we were going to lose the company. Thomas wanted to lay off 70% of staff and liquidate assets. I remember. I'd fought him for weeks on that decision. You convinced him to pivot to residential renovation work instead. You personally called every one of our commercial clients and negotiated payment plans so we could keep people employed. You saved this company, Emily. Not Thomas. Not Daniel. You. After he left, I sat alone thinking about what came next. The power was intoxicating but also terrifying. I'd never wanted to run the company alone. I'd wanted to build it together with Daniel, to create something meaningful as a team. That dream was dead now, killed by greed and arrogance and the kind of casual cruelty that destroys families. I announced new leadership the following day. Marcus would become Sue. Helen, our brilliant lead architect who Thomas had repeatedly passed over for promotion, became VP of Design. 2 other longtime employees got executive positions they'd earned through years of excellent work. The response on social media was immediate and enthusiastic. Our Instagram followers jumped by 10,000 in 48 hours. Clients who'd been wavering about renewing contracts called to congratulate me and confirm they were staying. Thomas, meanwhile, retreated to his country club to lick his wounds and plan his next move. It came in the form of a lawsuit, filed through his personal attorney, claiming I'd manipulated the equity agreement through fraud and deception. The lawsuit was baseless and would never survive a preliminary hearing, but it made headlines. Local business reporter, Whitaker family battle goes public. The story detailed the firing, the hidden contract, the dramatic boardroom reversal. I gave my first interview 2 days later. Not defensive, not angry, just factual. I explained how I'd helped build the company, how the termination had been handled, how the contract Thomas himself had signed had protected the business from hasty, poor decisions. Public opinion shifted decisively in my favor. Thomas became the villain in his own story. My lawyer called with news I'd been both expecting and dreading. Emily, we need to talk about the forensic audit. The preliminary findings are concerning. I'd initiated the audit immediately after taking control, knowing that Thomas's desperate rush to sell suggested he was hiding something. I just hadn't expected it to be this bad. How concerning? Funds diverted through shell consulting companies. Invoices for services never rendered. Personal expenses run through the business and disguised as operational costs. We're talking about substantial amounts over several years. My stomach turned. How substantial? North of $2 million. And Emily. Daniel's signature appears on many of the approval documents. I closed my eyes, feeling the last remnants of my marriage dissolve. He hadn't just betrayed me emotionally, he'd been actively stealing from the company we'd built together. What happens now? The auditors are required to report potential financial crimes to the authorities. Within 48 hours, this becomes a criminal investigation. I thought about Daniel's ultimatum, his certainty that I would crumble under pressure and sign whatever settlement he offered. He'd been so confident, so sure I was weak and easily manipulated. He'd had no idea what he was really dealing with. Daniel tried to reconcile 3 days later. He showed up at the apartment. My apartment now, since I'd formally had the locks changed, looking haggard and desperate. Emily, please. We need to talk about this rationally. Rationally? You helped your father steal $2 million from our company, then fired me to cover it up. What's rational about that? It wasn't stealing. It was just creative accounting. We were going to pay it back after the sale. You were going to pay back money you stole by selling a company you were intentionally undervaluing? That's not creative, Daniel. That's criminal fraud. He ran his hands through his hair and I noticed how much older he looked than just a week ago. My father pressured me. He said it was standard business practice that everyone did it. I didn't realize how bad it had gotten until the audit started. You could have told me. Any time in the past 2 years, you could have come to me and said, Emily, we have a problem. Instead, you helped him fire me and tried to sell the company before anyone discovered what you'd done. I panicked. I made terrible choices. But we can fix this together. We can tell the authorities it was all my father's idea, that I was just following orders. Get out, Daniel. Emily, please. I already froze all joint accounts. Your lawyer should have notified you yesterday. The divorce papers will be filed by end of business today. Get out. 2 weeks later, I sat in my office, Thomas's old office, though I'd already redecorated to erase his presence, when an unexpected call came through. Mrs. Morrison, this is James Chin from Cascade Development Group. We were the original buyers interested in purchasing Whitaker Development. My chest tightened. I'm aware. That sale has been cancelled. Actually, that's why I'm calling. We're still very interested in acquiring the company. But now we'd like to make an offer to you directly under different terms. I sat up straighter. I'm listening. Our original offer was $12 million. After seeing how you've stabilized operations, improved public perception, and cleaned house in just 2 weeks, we'd like to offer $24 million for full acquisition. Actually laughed. You want to pay double what you offered Thomas? Mrs. Morrison, Thomas was selling a company in crisis with questionable accounting and declining reputation. You're selling a company with strong leadership, loyal employees, and excellent growth potential. The value has fundamentally changed. I thought about it. $24 million. Financial security for life. Freedom from the daily reminder of everything Daniel and Thomas had done. I need time to think about this. Of course. Take all the time you need. The offer stands for 60 days. After I hung up, I sat staring out the window at the city skyline, genuinely unsure what I wanted anymore. My lawyer uncovered one more secret during the final stages of document review. Hidden in Thomas's personal files was a life insurance policy he'd taken out on himself 5 years ago, right around the time I'd married Daniel. The policy listed Daniel as sole beneficiary and was tied to company debt in a complex structure that essentially meant if Thomas died, Daniel would inherit the company but also massive liabilities that would force an immediate sale. He was planning this from the beginning, my lawyer explained. Thomas never intended for the company to survive long-term. He was extracting maximum value through those shell companies, planning to sell at the peak, and setting up Daniel to take the fall if anything went wrong. I thought about how Daniel had worshipped his father, how he'd defended every questionable decision, how he'd chosen Thomas over me again and again. And all along Thomas had been setting him up as a patsy. Daniel has no idea, does he? I doubt it. Thomas is smarter than we gave him credit for. Ruthless but smart. I felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for my soon-to-be ex-husband. He'd betrayed me, yes, but he'd also been used and manipulated by his own father. We'd both been pawns in Thomas's game, just playing different roles. Send Daniel's lawyer a copy of this insurance policy. He deserves to know what his father really thought of him. Thomas made one final attempt to regain control at the quarterly board meeting. He stood before the board, now including several new members I'd appointed, and presented what he claimed was a minority shareholder protection clause that required unanimous board approval for any major company decisions. This clause was part of the original Articles of Incorporation, Thomas declared, sliding copies across the table. It protects minority shareholders from being completely cut out of important decisions. My lawyer didn't even look worried. He simply opened his briefcase and placed different documents in front of each board member. These are proxy votes, he explained, from every minority shareholder in Whitaker Development. Mrs. Morrison contacted each one personally over the past 2 weeks, explained the situation and requested their support. 100% of minority shareholders have voted to allow Mrs. Morrison full operational authority. I watched Thomas's face as he realized I'd been 3 steps ahead of him the entire time. I'd anticipated this exact move and neutralized it before he could even deploy it. The board voted. Thomas's motion failed, 14-1. The only vote in his favor was his own. This concludes Mr. Whitaker's involvement in company governance, the board chair announced. Effective immediately, Thomas Whitaker is removed from all operational authority and will serve only as a passive minority shareholder. Thomas stood slowly, his age suddenly visible in the slump of his shoulders. You've destroyed everything I built. No, I said quietly. I've saved everything you almost destroyed. The divorce settlement was finalized 6 weeks later. Daniel sat across from me in his lawyer's office, looking defeated and hollow. The prenuptial agreement he'd insisted on 3 days before our wedding, the one his father had drafted to protect the family assets, had come back to haunt him spectacularly. Because all the growth in company value had happened during our marriage and I now own that company, the prenup actually protected my assets from him. I don't understand, Daniel said weakly, looking at his lawyer. How did this happen? The prenup protects premarital assets, his lawyer explained patiently. All of your premarital assets were tied up in the company. When you lost the company, you lost the protection. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. You'll receive $200,000 as a settlement, my lawyer said. That's generous, considering the circumstances. Daniel had been expecting millions. The number hit him like a physical blow. 200,000? That's nothing. That's what you would have left after legal fees from the fraud investigation anyway, I said quietly. Consider yourself lucky. The prosecutor agreed to reduce charges in exchange for your full cooperation against your father. Without that deal, you'd be facing 5 years in prison. He looked at me with something between hatred and heartbreak. I loved you, Emily. No, you didn't. You loved the idea of a wife who would work hard and ask for nothing. That's not the same thing. 1 year later, I stood in the renovated headquarters of Whitaker Development, now Morrison Development Company, watching 300 employees celebrate our best year on record. We'd expanded to 3 new cities, doubled our revenue, and won industry awards for innovation and workplace culture. Thomas sat in a coffee shop across the street. I'd seen him there sometimes, watching the building like a ghost haunting his former life. He'd lost everything. His company, his reputation, his relationship with his son. The fraud investigation had resulted in criminal charges and a settlement that took most of his personal wealth. Daniel worked as a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm in Seattle. We didn't speak. His mother had called once to yell at me for destroying her family, and I'd quietly reminded her that I hadn't stolen $2 million or committed fraud. The call ended quickly after that. I hadn't accepted Cascade Development's offer. Instead, I'd taken the company in a new direction. Sustainable development, affordable housing projects, community partnerships. We were building things that mattered, not just extracting maximum profit. The journalist who'd first reached out published a long-form piece about the case. From Fired to CO, how Emily Morrison saved the company that tried to erase her. It won a Regional Business Journalism Award. As I raised my glass to toast our team's success, I thought about that terrible day in the conference room when Thomas had called me just a helper. He tried to erase me from the business I'd built. Instead, he'd signed it all over.